Hidden 200 feet beneath a forgotten stone hut in the Montana pines, a poor mountain man uncovered $290 million in gold, bonds, and currency that powerful men had been hunting for over 40 years. And what he did next would prove that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you find, but who you become when you refuse to let it destroy you. Before we explore the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The winter of 2023 came early to the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, blanketing the pines and turning the wilderness into a cathedral of white and shadow. Most people had retreated to the valleys below to warm houses and working heaters, but Mason Cole stayed. He'd always stayed. His cabin sat at the edge of the tree line, 7 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail he'd cut himself years ago. The structure was small, barely 12 by 16 feet, built from logs he'd hauled and notched with hands that knew more about survival than comfort. Smoke curled from the metal chimney, a thin grey thread against the pearl sky. Mason was 38 but looked older. The mountains did that to a man. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes from squinting at distant ridges and wood smoke. His hands were calloused, scarred from axe handles and fishing line. His beard grew long and unkempt, more grey than brown now. He moved through the world with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy, and wasted energy could mean death when you lived this far from help. He hadn't always lived like this. 2 years ago, Mason had a wife, Sarah. They'd lived in Missoula, where he'd worked construction and she'd taught 2nd grade. They'd planned to buy a house, maybe have kids. Normal dreams. Safe dreams. Then one February morning, black ice on Highway 93 took her from him. The police said she didn't suffer. The truck driver said he never saw her. Mason said nothing at all. After the funeral, he'd sold everything, packed a truck with tools and supplies and driven into the Bitterroots. He'd found this spot purely by accident, or maybe by design. Some things you don't choose, they choose you. For 2 years, he'd survived. Trapped in winter, hunted in fall, fished in summer. He chopped wood until his shoulders screamed. He read by lamplight until his eyes burned. He talked to no one except the occasional hiker who stumbled past, lost and looking for the trail back to civilization. Most days, Mason wondered if he'd ever find his way back too. The storm hit on a Tuesday, though days of the week meant little to him now. The sky had been threatening since dawn, clouds rolling in like smoke, the air tasting of metal and cold. By noon, the snow was falling sideways, driven by winds that howled through the trees like wolves. Mason secured the cabin as best he could. He brought in extra wood, filled every container with water from the creek before it froze solid, and checked his food stores. He had enough dried venison and canned goods to last 2 weeks if he rationed carefully. 3 if he didn't mind being hungry. By nightfall, the storm was a living thing, clawing at the walls, rattling the windows. The cabin groaned under the assault. Mason sat by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching shadows dance across the rough-hewn walls. He thought about Sarah, the way he always did when the wind screamed. He thought about her laugh, her hands, the way she used to read aloud to him on winter nights just like this. The pain hadn't dulled. It had just learned to hide better. He must have dozed off because when he jerked awake, the fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was ice cold. His breath came out in clouds. He checked his watch, an old Timex Sarah had given him for their 5th anniversary, 3:17 in the morning. Something had woken him. He sat perfectly still, listening. The storm had eased slightly, the wind now a low moan instead of a roar. But there was another sound, faint and rhythmic. A creaking, like old wood under stress. It was coming from outside. Mason pulled on his boots and heavy coat. He grabbed his flashlight and his hunting rifle, a Winchester 30-30 that had belonged to his grandfather. He didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe a bear trying to get into his shed. Maybe a tree branch about to come down on the cabin. He stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow was waist-deep in places, sculpted into fantastic drifts by the wind. The trees were ghosts, their branches heavy with white. The moon broke through the clouds just enough to cast everything in silver-blue light. The creaking sound came again, louder now. It was coming from the north, deeper into the forest. Mason hesitated. Every instinct told him to go back inside, to let the storm and the darkness keep their secrets. But something pulled him forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that he'd spent 2 years running from the world and was tired of running. He moved through the snow, each step an effort. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating swirling flakes and ancient pines. He'd explored these woods extensively, knew them as well as anyone could, but the storm had changed everything. Familiar landmarks were buried or disguised. After 20 minutes of hard walking, he found the source of the sound. A massive pine had come down in the storm, its roots torn from the frozen earth. But what caught Mason's attention wasn't the fallen tree. It was what the tree had revealed. Behind where the roots had been, partially buried in snow and earth, was a structure. Stone walls, barely visible, emerging from the hillside like bones pushing through skin. Mason approached slowly, his heart suddenly pounding. He'd never seen this before, never even suspected it was here. He cleared away snow with his gloved hands, revealing more of the structure. It was old, built from fitted stones that had been carefully placed. A doorway, low and narrow, stood open like a mouth. The wooden door that had once sealed it lay rotting on the ground, finally torn free by the falling tree. The stone hut was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, built directly into the hillside. Whoever had constructed it had meant for it to last and to remain hidden. Mason shone his light inside. The beam revealed a simple space, empty except for scattered debris and what looked like an old wooden table collapsed in the corner. The walls were dry, protected by the earth and trees above. The floor was made of flat stones, fitted together with surprising skill. He stepped inside, ducking to clear the low entrance. The air was stale but not foul, just old, like opening a trunk that hadn't been touched in decades. His boots scraped against the stone floor. Something about the place felt intentional, purposeful. This wasn't a hunter's shelter or a prospector's cache. Someone had built this to last, had hidden it carefully. Mason moved deeper into the small space, examining the walls with his flashlight. The stones showed marks from tools, careful work. In one corner, he found the remains of what might have been shelves, the wood long since rotted away. He was about to leave when his boot struck something that sounded different. Not the solid thunk of stone on stone, but a hollow thump. He stopped, stepped back, stomped again. Definitely hollow. Mason knelt and brushed away dirt and small stones. His fingers found a seam in the floor, barely visible. A rectangular outline, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. His pulse quickened. He went back to the cabin and returned with a crowbar and a proper lantern. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and silent. Dawn was still hours away. Working by lantern light, Mason pried at the seam. The stones resisted at first, then one lifted free, then another. They'd been placed carefully, but not mortared, designed to be removed by someone who knew they were there. Beneath the stones was wood, old planks thick with age and dirt, and set into the wood was an iron ring, green with oxidation but still solid. Mason pulled. The trapdoor resisted, swollen with moisture and time. He braced his feet and pulled harder. Something gave with a groan of protest, and the door lifted free, releasing a breath of air that smelled of earth and stone and secrets kept for far too long. Below was darkness. Mason held the lantern over the opening. Wooden steps, rough-hewn but sturdy, descended into what looked like a cellar. The walls were stone, the same careful construction as the hut above. This was more than a hiding place. This was a vault. He should have waited, should have gone back to the cabin, maybe even hiked down to town and told someone what he'd found. But Mason had spent 2 years alone with nothing but ghosts and grief. The idea of waiting, of walking away from the first real mystery he'd encountered since Sarah died, felt impossible. He descended. The steps held his weight. 12 of them, leading down into a space much larger than the hut above. As Mason's head cleared the opening, the lantern light revealed a room at least 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough for him to stand upright. And it wasn't empty. Crates lined the walls, wooden boxes of varying sizes, stacked 2 and 3 high. In the center of the room sat a desk, old and solid, with a chair tucked neatly beneath it. Papers lay scattered across the desk's surface, yellowed and brittle. Mason stepped off the last stair, his breath coming faster now. The air down here was dry, preserved by the stone and earth. Everything had the quality of a museum, of things frozen in time. He moved to the nearest crate. It was roughly 2 feet square, made from thick pine planks and sealed with rusted nails. Stenciled on the side in faded black paint was a single word: private. Mason set down the lantern and used his crowbar to pry at the lid. The old nails shrieked in protest but gave way. The lid lifted free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that cracked and flaked at his touch, were smaller boxes. Mason lifted one out carefully. It was heavy, dense. He unwrapped the cloth. The box was made of dark wood, hinged and latched. He opened it. His breath caught. Gold coins, dozens of them gleaming in the lantern light despite decades in darkness. He picked one up, feeling its weight. It was real, solid, unmistakable. Mason set it down carefully and opened another crate. More gold, but also paper. He unfolded one document with trembling hands. It was a bearer bond, issued in 1976 for $50,000. And it wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stacked and wrapped. His mind raced. This wasn't a prospector's stash or someone's savings. This was serious wealth, hidden deliberately and left for decades. He moved to the desk, examining the papers scattered there. Most were too faded to read clearly, but one caught his eye. It was a letter, written in careful cursive on expensive paper that had yellowed but not crumbled. The date at the top read April 19th, 1977. Mason read by lantern light, his cold-numbed fingers holding the fragile paper. "To whoever finds this," it began. "My name is Henry. I won't write my last name because it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I've left here and why." The handwriting was elegant, educated. Mason continued reading. "I made my fortune in timber and land, buying and selling at the right times, watching the West grow into something I barely recognized. By the time I was 40, I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I had houses, cars, respect. I had everything except what mattered." Mason turned the page carefully. "I lost my wife to cancer in 1973. We had no children. After she died, I realized how hollow it all was. The money, the success, it meant nothing without someone to share it with. I tried giving it away, but the lawyers and accountants made it complicated. Everyone wanted a piece. Everyone had an angle." The letter continued. "So I did something simpler. I liquidated everything I could into forms that would last. Gold, bonds, currency from stable governments. I brought it here to a place I'd found years ago while hunting, a place so remote that the world might forget it existed. I built this vault into the mountain itself, stone by stone, working through 2 summers and a fall. I told no one." Mason's hands shook slightly as he read on. "I kept enough to live on for a few years. The rest, I left here. I don't know who will find this or when. Maybe it will be decades from now, maybe centuries. But whoever you are, know this. This fortune was built on the backs of men who cut down forests and carved up valleys. It came from a world that took more than it gave. If you found this, it's yours. But I have one request." Mason leaned closer to read the faded words. "Don't let it poison you. Don't let it make you into what I almost became. Someone so focused on having that they forgot about being. Use it to help people. Use it to do what I couldn't figure out how to do. Make it mean something." The letter was signed simply, "Henry." Below the signature was a postscript. "The total value at 1977 prices is approximately $87 million. I imagine it's worth considerably more now. There's an inventory in the desk drawer. Everything is here." Mason sat down hard in the old chair. It creaked but held. 87 million in 1977. With inflation, with the appreciation of gold, With decades of accrued interest on bearer bonds, that could be worth... He couldn't even calculate it. 200 million? 300? His mind spun. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen. Poor mountain men living in tiny cabins 7 miles from civilization didn't stumble into hidden fortunes buried in the wilderness. But the gold in his hand was real. The bonds were real. The careful stonework around him was real. Mason stood and moved through the cellar methodically, opening crates, examining contents. Each one revealed more wealth. Gold American eagles, Krugerrands, Canadian maple leafs, Swiss francs, German marks, bearer bonds from a dozen countries. Stacks of $100 bills in plastic sleeves, serial numbers sequential, looking as crisp as the day they were printed. In the back corner, he found something different. A crate marked personal. Inside were photograph albums, journals, a wedding ring on a chain, and a small oil painting of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. Henry's wife. Mason stared at the painting for a long time. He recognized the look in the painted eyes. It was the same look Sarah used to have, that mixture of love and hope, and the quiet certainty that everything would be okay as long as they were together. He understood now why Henry had built this place. Not just to hide money, but to hide from a world that no longer made sense without the person who mattered most. Mason had done the same thing. He'd just used a cabin instead of a stone vault. He sat in the darkness for a long time, the lantern casting shifting shadows on the walls. Around him sat more wealth than he'd ever imagined, enough to change his life completely, enough to never worry about money again, enough to do almost anything, and all he could think about was the man who'd hidden it here, working alone, stone by stone, trying to build something that would outlast his grief. The sky was turning grey with dawn when Mason finally climbed back up the stairs. His legs were stiff from the cold and the hours spent in the cellar. His mind was a storm of thoughts, none of them clear. He replaced the floor stones carefully, covering the entrance. He had no plan yet, no idea what to do. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand, and there was no going back to the simple existence of chopping wood and trapping rabbits and hiding from the world. The wilderness had given up its secret. Now he had to figure out what to do with it. Mason returned to the cabin as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and pink. The beauty of it struck him in a way it hadn't in months, maybe years. For the first time since Sarah died, he felt something other than numbness. He felt alive, terrified, confused, overwhelmed, but alive. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire and made coffee with shaking hands. He sat at his small table, Sarah's photograph on the wall across from him, and tried to think clearly. The smart thing would be to tell someone. The authorities, maybe. A lawyer. Someone who knew how these things worked. But something held him back. Henry had hidden this fortune for a reason. He'd wanted it found eventually, yes, but by someone who would understand, someone who would do the right thing. Mason wasn't sure he knew what the right thing was, but he knew that the moment he told anyone, this would spiral out of his control. There would be questions, investigations, claims. The government would want taxes. Henry's distant relatives, if any existed, would crawl out of the woodwork. Lawyers would fight over every coin and bond. And the money meant to help people would get trapped in legal battles for years, maybe decades. He thought about Henry's letter, the request that the fortune be used to help people. He thought about the 2 years he'd spent hiding in these mountains, running from pain instead of facing it. He thought about Sarah, who had spent her life teaching children because she believed in making the world better one small act at a time. Maybe this was his chance to do something that mattered. Not for himself, but for the memory of 2 people who'd understood that money without purpose was just paper and metal. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he'd found. Over the next 3 days, Mason made trips to the stone hut, carrying supplies and equipment. He brought a better lantern, a notebook, a camera. He photographed everything, catalogued each crate, made lists. The inventory Henry had left was meticulous. Mason cross-referenced it with what he found, and everything matched. Henry had been thorough, organized, precise. The final count staggered him. 372 pounds of gold in various forms. Bearer bonds totaling over $90 million at face value, many of which would have appreciated significantly. Currency from a dozen countries, carefully preserved. Stock certificates from companies that no longer existed and some that had become giants. Rare coins, silver bars, even a collection of uncut diamonds in a small leather pouch. Using conservative estimates and current prices he found in an old almanac he'd brought from the cabin, Mason calculated the total value. $290 million, give or take. He sat in the cellar, surrounded by more wealth than most people could comprehend, and laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire reality had shifted on its axis. 3 days ago, he'd been worried about having enough firewood for the winter. Now he was sitting on enough money to buy the entire mountain and everything on it. The absurdity was almost too much to process. On the 4th day, Mason noticed something he'd missed before. Tire tracks in the snow, partially filled but still visible, leading up the old logging road that passed a mile below his cabin. Fresh tracks. Recent. Someone had been up here. His stomach tightened. The logging road was rarely used, especially in winter. The only reason someone would drive up there was if they were looking for something. Or someone. Mason spent that night at the cabin with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the windows. Nobody came. But the tracks bothered him. They felt like a warning, a reminder that he wasn't as isolated as he'd believed. The next morning, he hiked down to the small town of Clearwater, population 347, nestled in the valley 12 miles from his cabin. He hadn't been to town in over a month. The general store was run by a woman named Ruth in her 60s, who'd lived in Clearwater her entire life. She greeted Mason with the warmth of someone who knew everyone and worried about them all. "Mason, good to see you. Thought maybe the storm got you." He smiled. "Takes more than snow to get rid of me." "What brings you down? Need supplies?" "Just some basics. And I was wondering if you'd heard anything strange lately. Anyone asking about the old Forest Service roads? Maybe looking for old cabins or structures?" Ruth's expression shifted slightly. "Funny you should ask. Had 2 men in here last week. City types, expensive coats. They were asking about old mining claims and abandoned buildings up in the Bitterroots. Said they were historians doing research." Mason kept his voice casual. "They say where they were from?" "Seattle, I think. Didn't give names, just bought some maps and left." She paused. "Why? They cause you trouble?" No, just curious. You know how it is up there. Like to know if there are people wandering around." Ruth nodded, but her eyes stayed sharp. She'd known Mason long enough to sense when he wasn't telling the whole story. He bought coffee, canned goods, batteries, and left quickly. His mind raced as he hiked back up the mountain. 2 men asking about abandoned buildings. It could be innocent, or it could mean someone knew about Henry's vault. But how? Henry had been dead for decades, presumably. His letter was dated 1977. That was 46 years ago. Anyone who'd known him would be old or dead themselves. Unless Henry had told someone, unless there were records somewhere, unless the secret wasn't as secret as it seemed. Mason spent the next 2 days watching the approaches to his cabin and the stone hut. He saw nothing suspicious, but the feeling of being watched persisted. On the 3rd night, he made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone he could trust, someone who understood the law and could help him navigate what came next. Because something was coming. He could feel it. The question was whether he could stay ahead of it long enough to honor Henry's wish and do something meaningful with what he'd found. As he sat by the fire that night, staring at Sarah's photograph, Mason realized something fundamental had changed. For 2 years, he'd been waiting to die, not actively, but passively, letting life happen around him without participating. He'd retreated to the wilderness not to find himself, but to lose himself in the white noise of survival. But finding that vault, reading Henry's letter, holding that enormous fortune in his hands, It had cracked something open inside him, a part of him he'd thought was dead. Purpose. Henry had asked that the money be used to help people. Sarah had spent her life helping people. Maybe this was his chance to honor both of them, to take something built on loss and turn it into something that mattered. He just had to survive long enough to make it happen. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. Mason checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, and settled in for another long night of watching the darkness. The fortune in the stone hut wasn't just money anymore. It was responsibility, opportunity, and danger all wrapped together. And somewhere out there, in that vast wilderness of snow and stone and ancient trees, someone was looking for it. The only question was whether they knew he'd already found it. Mason returned to the stone hut every day for the next week, each visit revealing layers of Henry's carefully hidden fortune that defied belief. He worked systematically, opening crates in order, photographing contents, making notes in a weathered journal he'd brought from the cabin. The cellar became familiar, almost comfortable, despite the weight of what it contained. The second crate he opened held bearer bonds, hundreds of them, each sealed in individual plastic sleeves that had kept them pristine despite the decades. Mason had never seen a bearer bond before, but Henry's meticulous notes explained everything. These weren't like regular bonds. They weren't registered to anyone. Whoever physically held them owned them. They were essentially paper money for the wealthy, untraceable and anonymous. The denominations staggered him. $50,000, $100,000. Some for $250,000, issued by the United States Treasury, by Swiss banks, by German financial institutions, all dated between 1974 and 1977. Mason calculated as he went. This crate alone held over $40 million in face value, and bearer bonds, unlike regular bonds, often appreciated beyond their stated worth, especially vintage ones that had been properly maintained. The third crate contained currency. Not American dollars, though there were plenty of those, but money from around the world. Swiss francs bundled in stacks of 100 notes, German Deutsche Marks wrapped in bank paper, British pounds sterling in denominations Mason had only seen in movies, Japanese yen, Canadian dollars, even gold-backed currencies from countries that no longer existed. Each bundle was wrapped in plastic, then sealed in airtight containers with moisture absorbers. Henry had thought of everything. The bills looked as crisp as the day they were printed. But it was the fourth crate that stopped Mason cold. Inside, wrapped in velvet cloth, were 23 leather-bound journals. Each was filled with Henry's precise handwriting, dated and organized. Mason lifted one out carefully, the leather smooth and cool in his hands. He sat at the old desk and began to read. The first journal was dated January 1st, 1974. Henry's writing was clear, almost elegant, the work of someone educated in an era when penmanship mattered. "Today I buried my wife," the entry began. Margaret Ann, age 41. 23 years of marriage ended by a disease that ate through her like fire through paper. The doctors said it was pancreatic cancer. I say it was cruelty pure and simple. She never smoked, never drank, lived clean and good, and still it took her. Mason's throat tightened. He knew that pain, that rage at the unfairness of loss. Henry's entries continued, raw and honest in a way that made Mason feel like an intruder, but he kept reading, drawn into this stranger's grief. The funeral was yesterday. 200 people came, business associates mostly, people I'd worked with, made money with, competed against. They all said the right things. They all looked appropriately sad. But none of them knew her. Not really. They knew Margaret Cole, wife of Henry Cole, timber baron. They didn't know Maggie, who laughed at terrible jokes and couldn't carry a tune but sang anyway. Who wanted children but couldn't have them. Who made our house a home even though it was too big and too empty. Cole, Henry Cole. Mason filed the name away. The journal entries chronicled Henry's descent into isolation. He sold his companies, liquidated properties, cut ties with associates. He described it all in matter-of-fact terms, like someone documenting a business transaction, rather than the dismantling of a life. Today I finalized the sale of Cole timber to a conglomerate out of Portland. They paid $47 million. The company my grandfather started in 1903, gone. I feel nothing. Margaret would have been horrified at how little I care. Mason flipped through the pages, watching years compress into paragraphs. Henry had been methodical in his dismantling, selling everything piece by piece, converting it all into portable wealth. The entries from late 1974 described his discovery of this place. Found something today while hunting elk north of the Bitterroot Divide. An old mining road, overgrown, leading to a hillside that looks like nothing special. But there's something about it, remote, forgotten. The kind of place the world overlooks. Exactly what I need. The next several months of entries detailed the construction of the vault. Henry had done most of the work himself, hauling stones, digging into the hillside, building the cellar by hand. It was back-breaking labor, and he described it with something approaching reverence. Working with my hands again feels right. I'd forgotten what it was like to build something real, something physical. For 20 years I built empires of paper and contracts. Now I'm stacking stones. There's honesty in it. These stones won't betray you. They won't get sick. They just are. Mason read late into the night, lantern light flickering across the pages. Henry's story unfolded like a novel, except it was real, lived by a man who'd sat in this same spot decades ago, writing by this same desk. In mid-1976, Henry wrote about his decision to hide his fortune. I tried giving it away properly, called lawyers, set up meetings with charities and foundations. Within a week, I had a dozen people trying to manage it for me, telling me how to spend my own money, what causes were worthy, what tax advantages I could gain. They meant well, probably, but they missed the point. This isn't about tax advantages. This isn't about having my name on a building. Margaret and I used to talk about making a difference quietly, helping people who needed it without making a spectacle. But the system doesn't work that way. The system wants forms and committees and oversight. So I'm doing something the system can't touch. I'm hiding it, all of it. Let someone find it someday, someone who stumbles across it without looking, someone who might understand what it's supposed to mean. Mason set down the journal, his hands shaking slightly. Henry had been preparing this moment for decades. Every stone in this cellar, every carefully wrapped bundle of currency, every bearer bond sealed in plastic, it was all meant to be found eventually by someone Henry would never meet. And somehow, impossibly, Mason had become that person. He picked up another journal, this one from 1977. The entries were shorter now, more sporadic. Henry's handwriting had become shakier. Not feeling well lately. Doctors say it's my heart. Fitting, I suppose. Margaret took hers with her, left mine damaged. I've finished the vault. Everything is secure. The inventory is complete. I wrote a letter to whoever finds this, tried to explain what I want. I don't know if they'll listen. People rarely do what you hope they will. But maybe, just maybe, this fortune will do some good. More good than it did in my hands. The final entry was dated April 23rd, 1977. Going back to Missoula today. The cabin I've been renting here is too cold, and I'm too tired to keep pretending I'm young enough for this life. I've sealed the entrance to the hut, planted trees around it, done everything I can to hide it. If someone finds it in 10 years or 100, I hope they're worthy of it. Margaret would have known how to choose. I only know how to wait and hope. That was the last entry. Mason searched through the remaining journals, but they were empty, waiting for words that never came. He did some quick math. If Henry had returned to Missoula in April of 1977, and if his heart condition was as serious as the journal suggested, he probably hadn't lived much longer. Mason made a mental note to search obituaries from that year, but he suspected he knew how the story ended. A wealthy recluse dies alone. His fortune, hidden in the mountains, waits for decades, and a grieving carpenter-turned-mountain man stumbles across it during a winter storm. It was the kind of story people wouldn't believe if you told them. Mason carefully replaced the journals in their crate. His mind spun with everything he'd learned. Henry Cole, timber baron, widower, a man who'd turned his back on civilization and built a vault in the wilderness to hide wealth he no longer wanted, but couldn't bring himself to simply destroy. The parallels to his own life were uncomfortable. Mason had run to the wilderness after Sarah died, had cut himself off from the world, had spent 2 years building his own kind of vault, one made of silence and isolation instead of stone. But Henry had left something behind. A fortune, yes, but more than that. A challenge. A request that whoever found this wealth would use it to help people, to make it mean something. Mason climbed back up to the surface as dawn broke. The forest was silent except for the whisper of wind through pine needles. He stood at the entrance to the stone hut, looking out at the wilderness that had become his home. What was he supposed to do with $290 million? The question felt absurd. Most people would know exactly what to do. Buy a house, travel, never work again, live in comfort forever. But Mason had already tried comfort. He'd had a house, a wife, a normal life. And when Sarah died, all of that comfort had meant nothing. It hadn't saved her. It hadn't filled the hole she left behind. Money couldn't bring back the dead. Henry had learned that. Mason knew it too. But maybe, just maybe, it could help the living. He thought about Clearwater, the small town in the valley. He thought about Ruth at the general store, who'd mentioned that the school was struggling, that families were leaving because there were no jobs, that the clinic had closed because they couldn't afford a full-time doctor. He thought about the families he'd seen during his rare trips to town. Young couples trying to make it work on minimum wage jobs. Elderly people choosing between medication and food. Kids who deserved better than what this dying town could offer. What if Henry's fortune could change that? Not by throwing money around carelessly, but by building something that lasted, something that helped people the way Henry and Margaret had wanted to help people. The idea felt too big, too complicated. Mason was a carpenter, not a philanthropist. He didn't know the first thing about foundations or legal trusts or how to distribute wealth responsibly. But Henry hadn't known either. And he'd figured it out, at least the hiding part. Maybe Mason could figure out the giving part. First, though, he needed to understand the legal situation. Who actually owned this fortune? Was it finders keepers? Did it belong to Henry's estate? Would the government claim it? Would taxes consume most of it? Mason needed answers, but getting answers meant talking to people, and talking to people meant risking exposure. The moment anyone knew about this vault, everything would change. He spent the next 2 days at the cabin, trying to research using his old laptop and a satellite internet connection that worked about half the time. He searched for information about found treasures, abandoned property, bearer bonds, laws governing discovered wealth. What he learned wasn't encouraging. Found money, legally speaking, belonged to the property owner where it was found. But whose property was this? Mason checked land records. The hillside where the vault was hidden was technically part of the Bitterroot National Forest, which meant it was federal land. That complicated everything. Treasures found on federal land generally belonged to the government. There were procedures, forms, agencies that handled such things. The process could take years, and there was no guarantee the finder got to keep anything. Bearer bonds were another problem. Many countries had outlawed them or restricted their use because of concerns about money laundering and tax evasion. Some of Henry's bonds might not be redeemable at all. Others might trigger investigations into their origin. The gold was probably the safest asset. Gold was gold. But selling large quantities of gold attracted attention. The IRS watched for exactly that kind of thing. Mason closed his laptop, frustrated. Every avenue seemed to lead to lawyers, bureaucrats, and complications. Henry had hidden his fortune to keep it away from exactly these systems, and now those same systems stood between Mason and any hope of using the money the way Henry had intended. Maybe there was another way. Maybe he didn't need to report everything at once. Maybe he could move slowly, carefully, selling small amounts of gold, cashing bonds gradually, building up resources without triggering alarms. But that felt dishonest, sneaky. And if he was caught, he'd lose everything and probably face criminal charges. Mason was still wrestling with these thoughts when he heard the sound of an engine. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A vehicle, coming up the old logging road. He grabbed his rifle and binoculars and moved to a ridge point that overlooked the road. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of a dark SUV, moving slowly, like someone searching for something. The vehicle stopped about a mile below his cabin, right where the logging road intersected with an old game trail. Two men got out. Even from this distance, Mason could tell they weren't locals. They wore expensive outdoor gear, the kind of jackets that cost more than most people in Clearwater made in a month. One of them held what looked like a GPS unit. The other had a map. They were searching for something specific. Mason's blood ran cold. He watched them for 20 minutes. They walked around, checking coordinates, taking photos. They didn't come any closer, but they didn't need to. They were in the area. They were looking. Eventually, they got back in the SUV and drove away, but Mason knew they'd be back. Someone else knew about the vault. Maybe not its exact location, but they knew it existed. They knew to look in this area. That night, Mason didn't sleep. He sat in the cabin with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the windows, listening for engines or footsteps or any sound that didn't belong. His mind raced. How did they know? Henry's journals hadn't mentioned telling anyone. The letter he'd left suggested he'd died without revealing the location. So where had the information come from? Maybe Henry had written something else, some document Mason hadn't found. Maybe there were bank records or property deeds that hinted at the location. Maybe someone had seen Henry building the vault all those years ago and never forgot. Or maybe someone had been looking for Henry's fortune for decades, searching systematically through the Bitterroot Mountains, checking every abandoned structure and hidden canyon. Mason thought about the men Ruth had mentioned, the ones asking about old buildings and mining claims. At the time, he'd been suspicious, but not alarmed. Now he realized they'd probably been part of the same search. They were getting close. And when they found the vault, they wouldn't care about Henry's letter or his wishes. They'd take everything and disappear, and Henry's dream of helping people would die with the discovery. Mason couldn't let that happen, but he also couldn't defend a $290 million fortune by himself in the middle of the wilderness. He needed help, real help. The question was who to trust. Dawn came cold and grey. Mason made coffee with shaking hands, exhaustion pulling at him like a weight. He'd dozed off a few times during the night, but never deeply, always jerking awake at small sounds that turned out to be wind or animals. He needed to make a decision. Stay silent and risk losing everything, or reach out for help and risk exposure. Both options felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. He was still weighing his choices when he heard the sound again. Engines, multiple engines this time. Mason grabbed his binoculars and moved to the ridge. What he saw made his stomach drop. 3 SUVs this time, all dark, all expensive looking. They'd driven farther up the logging road, much closer to his cabin than before. Men were getting out, at least 8 of them. They had equipment, serious equipment. Metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar units, surveying tools. This wasn't casual exploration anymore. This was a professional operation. One of the men pointed toward the hillside where the stone hut was hidden. They were close, too close. Mason watched them spread out and begin working, methodically scanning the area. They were searching in a grid pattern, the kind of systematic approach that would eventually find anything hidden in the search area. They'd find the vault. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. What happens next will force a mountain man to choose between safety and honor, will reveal a deadly truth about who's hunting Henry's fortune, and will test whether one man can protect a legacy worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Mason descended from the ridge as quietly as possible. His heart hammered against his ribs. The men below were professionals, organized and equipped. They weren't treasure hunters hoping to get lucky. They were a team that knew what they were looking for and had the resources to find it. He needed to move fast. Back at the cabin, Mason packed a bag with essentials: food, water, ammunition, his satellite phone, and Henry's letter. He couldn't take the journals or the inventory, too much to carry, but he photographed every page with his phone, uploading them to a cloud storage account he rarely used. If something happened to him, at least there'd be a record. He also did something that felt reckless but necessary. He removed several gold coins from the vault, maybe 20 of them, and a handful of the smaller bearer bonds. He sealed them in waterproof bags and hid them in 3 different locations around his property, places only he knew about. Insurance in case the vault was discovered and emptied. Then he hiked to a high point with cell reception and made a call he'd been dreading. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Garrett Law Office. I need to speak with Garrett, please. Tell him it's Mason Cole calling." There was a pause. "Mason? That you? Hell, son, haven't heard from you in 2 years. Thought maybe you'd gone full hermit." Thomas Garrett was 72 years old, a lawyer who'd practiced in Montana for 47 years. He'd handled Sarah's estate after she died, had been patient and kind when Mason could barely string 2 sentences together. If there was anyone in the world Mason trusted, it was Tom. "I need help, Tom. Legal help. And I need you to promise me you won't tell anyone what I'm about to say until I give you permission." The lightness left Tom's voice. "Attorney-client privilege. You know that. What's going on?" Mason took a deep breath and told him everything. The storm, the fallen tree, the stone hut, the vault, Henry's fortune, the men searching. He spoke quickly, words tumbling out, 2 weeks of secrets spilling into the mountain air. When he finished, there was a long silence. "Mason," Tom finally said, his voice careful. "Are you sure about this? I mean, are you absolutely certain you're not misreading what you found? $290 million is not a number that just shows up in the real world." "I'm certain. I've catalogued everything. I have photos. I can send you Henry's letter right now." "Do that. Send everything you have." Mason spent the next 10 minutes uploading files through his spotty internet connection. Photos of gold coins, bearer bonds, currency stacks, Henry's letter, pages from the journals. Tom was silent as he reviewed the files. Mason could hear him breathing, could imagine him staring at his computer screen, trying to process what he was seeing. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Tom whispered. "This is real." "I know." "And there are people actively searching for it. Right now. Today. They're less than 2 miles from the location." Another pause. "Mason, you need to come to town. Right now. We need to report this to the authorities, get protection, figure out the legal angle. You can't sit on something like this." "If I report it, what happens?" Tom sighed. "Honestly, it gets complicated. The vault is on federal land, so the government has first claim. There will be investigations into the origin of the funds, questions about taxes, probate issues, if Henry Cole had any living relatives. It could take years to sort out, and you, as the finder, might get a reward, maybe 10% if you're lucky, maybe nothing. And Henry's wish that it be used to help people would be considered but not binding. The law doesn't care much about the wishes of dead men who hide fortunes in mountains." Mason closed his eyes. "There has to be another way." "There probably is, but none that are legal. Look, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but you're sitting on a potential crime scene. That fortune was hidden deliberately, which raises questions about tax evasion, money laundering, all kinds of things. If you try to move it or sell parts of it without reporting it, you become a criminal yourself. And these men searching for it, if they're organized enough to have ground-penetrating radar and multiple vehicles, they're not going to be polite if they find you first." Mason knew Tom was right. Every instinct told him to report it, to let the authorities handle it, to walk away clean. But something in him resisted. Henry had trusted that whoever found his fortune would do the right thing, not the legal thing. There was a difference. "Give me a week," Mason said. 1 week to figure this out before we report anything." "Mason, that's a terrible idea." "I know, but I'm asking anyway." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "You're not going to do anything stupid, are you?" "Define stupid." "Don't make me regret this. 1 week. Then we talk to the authorities, or I'm calling them myself. Deal?" "Deal." Mason ended the call and stood on the ridge, looking out at the wilderness that had been his refuge for 2 years. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of view that made you believe the world was still good. But down below, somewhere in those trees, men with expensive equipment were hunting for a fortune they didn't deserve. And Mason stood between them and it, one man with a rifle and a promise to a stranger who'd been dead for 46 years. The odds weren't good, but then they never had been. That night, Mason didn't go back to his cabin. Instead, he camped in a shelter he'd built a year ago, halfway between the cabin and the stone hut, hidden in a thick grove of pines. He kept watch through the night, rifle ready, waiting for movement. Around 2 a.m, he saw lights. Flashlights moving through the forest, heading toward the stone hut. They were searching at night now, when they thought no one would see. Mason counted at least 5 beams spread out in a line. They were thorough, professional. They'd reach the hut by dawn if they maintained their current pattern. He had maybe 6 hours to decide what to do. Fight? 5 armed men against 1 in darkness, in terrain they'd been studying. That was suicide. Run? Take the gold he'd hidden and disappear. Let them find the vault, walk away from Henry's dream. That was surrender. Or something else. Something riskier but maybe smarter. Lead them away. Mason waited until the lights were committed to their search pattern. Then he moved. He circled wide, staying low, using every bit of fieldcraft he'd learned over 2 years in these mountains. He reached a position about half a mile from the searchers and did something that felt insane. He fired 3 shots into the air. The sound echoed through the canyon, impossibly loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The flashlight beams stopped moving. Then they turned, all of them, toward the sound. Mason ran. He crashed through the forest, making as much noise as possible, leading them away from the stone hut. Behind him, he heard shouts, engines starting, beams of light swinging wildly. They were following him. Good. He led them on a chase that lasted 2 hours, always staying just ahead, just visible enough to keep them pursuing. He knew these mountains. They didn't. He used that advantage, leading them through the roughest terrain, through deadfalls and ravines, always moving away from the vault. By the time the sun rose, he'd led them nearly 5 miles from the stone hut into a box canyon he knew had only one exit. Then he vanished. He climbed a rock face they wouldn't think to check, found a cave he'd discovered months ago, and waited. Below, the men searched for hours, frustrated, confused. Eventually they gave up and headed back. Mason waited until they were gone, then made his own way back, circling wide. He'd bought time, maybe a day, maybe 2, but he'd also shown his hand. They knew someone was out here now, someone who didn't want them finding what they were looking for. The game had changed, and Mason still had no idea how it would end. Mason returned to his cabin just after dawn, exhausted from the night's chase. His legs burned, his lungs ached, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. But rest wasn't an option. He'd bought time, maybe 24 hours, but those men would be back. And next time, they'd be more prepared. He splashed ice-cold water on his face from the bucket by the door and forced himself to think clearly. The situation had escalated beyond anything he could handle alone. Tom Garrett was right. He needed help, real help. But first, he needed to understand exactly who he was up against. Mason spent the morning monitoring the logging road through binoculars from his ridge position. The SUVs returned around 10, parking in a different location this time, closer to the main road. The men gathered in a circle, clearly discussing strategy. One of them, tall with silver hair even visible from this distance, seemed to be in charge. He gestured emphatically, pointing toward the mountains. They weren't giving up. If anything, they looked more determined. Mason hiked back down and made another call to Tom Garrett. "I need you to research something," Mason said without preamble. "Henry Cole, timber baron from the 1970s. I need to know everything. Family, business associates, anyone who might have known about that vault. And I need to know who might be looking for it now." Tom's voice was strained. "Mason, where are you? Are you safe?" "For now, but there are at least 8 men with professional equipment searching these mountains. They're not tourists, Tom. They know what they're looking for." "Then you need to come in." File a report with the sheriff. Get protection. Not yet. Not until I understand what I'm dealing with. Can you research Henry Cole or not? Tom sighed heavily. I'll see what I can find. But Mason, you're playing a dangerous game. These people, whoever they are, they're not going to stop just because you led them on a wild goose chase. I know. That's why I need information. Mason ended the call and decided to risk one more trip to the vault. If those men found it while he was away, he wanted to at least have documented everything thoroughly. He needed more of Henry's story, more proof of the man's intentions. The stone hut was undisturbed when he arrived. Mason moved quickly, descending into the cellar with his camera and flashlight. He went straight to the crate containing Henry's journals and pulled out volumes he hadn't read yet. One journal, dated 1975, contained entries that made Mason's blood run cold. Had a visit today from my former business partner, Vincent. He'd heard through the grapevine that I'd liquidated everything. Wanted to know what I was doing with the money. I told him it was none of his concern. He got angry, said we'd built Cole Timber together, that he deserved to know. But that's not true. Vincent was an investor, nothing more. He put in money and took out profits. When I sold, he got his share, several $1 million. But greed has no ceiling. He wants more. He thinks I'm hiding something. He's right, but he'll never find it. Mason flipped forward several pages. Vincent came back. This time he brought his son Marcus. Younger, harder, meaner. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. Marcus said they had ways of finding out what I'd done with the money. I told them to leave and not come back. Marcus smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. As they drove away, I realized I might have made an enemy. But what else could I do? This money isn't theirs. It belongs to the future, to whoever finds it with clean hands. The final entry about Vincent was dated March of 1977. Saw Vincent in town today. He looked sick, old. We didn't speak, but his eyes followed me. I think he's still obsessed with finding my fortune. Let him look. By the time anyone figures it out, I'll be dead and it won't matter. Vincent will never find it. He doesn't understand the wilderness the way I do. He thinks money is the answer to everything. He's wrong. Money is just a question, and most people don't know how to answer it correctly. Mason photographed the pages, his mind racing. Vincent and his son Marcus. Were they still alive? Marcus would be in his 60s or 70s now, but certainly old enough to be funding a search operation. And if Vincent had spent decades obsessed with Henry's hidden fortune, he might have passed that obsession to his son. It would explain the professional operation, the resources being devoted to finding the vault. This wasn't random treasure hunters. This was revenge, delayed by decades, but no less intense. Mason was about to leave when he noticed another crate he hadn't opened yet. It was smaller than the others, set apart in a corner. The word personal was stenciled on the side, and unlike the other crates, this one had a simple latch rather than nails. He opened it carefully. Inside were more documents, but these were different. Legal papers, mostly. Henry's will, dated April of 1977. Mason read it by flashlight, his heart pounding. The will was simple, almost brutally so. Henry left his remaining property, a small house in Missoula, to a local church. His car and personal effects were to be sold, with proceeds going to cancer research. And then at the bottom, a paragraph that made Mason's hands shake. Regarding any other assets, properties, or valuables that may be discovered after my death, including but not limited to those I have sequestered for safekeeping in locations known only to me, I direct that said assets be used exclusively for charitable purposes benefiting the working families of Montana, particularly those in rural areas who lack access to adequate healthcare, education, and economic opportunity. I appoint no executor for these hidden assets, as I trust that whoever discovers them will have the integrity to honor this wish. If they do not, then perhaps humanity is beyond redemption, and it doesn't matter anyway. Below the paragraph, Henry had written a note in pen. To my former partner Vincent, who I know will search for this fortune until his dying day. You won't find it, and if by some miracle your descendants do, this document makes clear that it was never meant for you. You had your share. This is for people who actually need it." Mason sat back, overwhelmed. Henry had known Vincent would keep looking, had known the obsession would outlive him, and had taken legal steps to ensure the fortune couldn't be claimed by Vincent's family even if they found it. This will, combined with Henry's letter, created a clear paper trail of intent. The money was meant for charity, specifically for Montana's rural families. Mason wasn't just some random guy who'd stumbled across treasure. He was, in a strange way, the executor Henry had never officially appointed. He photographed the will from every angle, then noticed something else in the crate, a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the Sheriff of Missoula County." Mason's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter dated the same day as the will. "If you are reading this, then someone has discovered my hidden assets and has responsibly reported them to the authorities. This letter is to confirm that said assets exist, that they were legally obtained through the sale of my business interests between 1974 and 1977, and that all applicable taxes were paid at the time. The subsequent hiding of these assets was not an attempt at tax evasion, but rather a personal choice to remove them from circulation until such time as they could do the most good. I have paid all taxes owed on the original amounts. If additional taxes are due upon discovery, I direct that they be paid from the assets themselves before any charitable distribution occurs. Attached, please find documentation of the original transactions, tax payments, and accounting records. Everything was done legally. I simply chose to hide what was legally mine." The attached documents were extensive. Henry had kept meticulous records, every sale, every transaction, every tax payment, all documented and preserved in waterproof folders. Mason realized what he was holding. Henry had protected his fortune, not just physically, but legally. He'd created a paper trail that proved the money was obtained legitimately, that taxes had been paid, that his intentions were charitable. Anyone who found this vault wouldn't just find wealth, they'd find a complete legal framework for distributing it. Henry Cole had been thorough to the point of genius. Mason packed the documents carefully and was preparing to leave when he heard something that stopped him cold. Voices, above ground, close. He killed his flashlight immediately and moved to the base of the stairs, listening. At least 2 men, maybe 3, talking in low tones. They were at the entrance to the stone hut. "The door's been opened recently," one voice said. "See the disturbed snow?" "Someone's been here," another agreed. "Spread out, check the area." Mason's mind raced. He was trapped. The only exit was the stairway, and men were literally standing at the top of it. If he tried to leave, they'd see him immediately. He looked around the cellar desperately. There had to be another way out. Henry wouldn't have built a vault with only one entrance. That was too risky. He searched frantically, running his hands along the stone walls, looking for seams or hidden doors. Nothing. The walls were solid. Above, footsteps crossed the stone floor of the hut. Someone was coming to the trapdoor. Mason grabbed his rifle and backed into the deepest corner of the cellar, behind a stack of crates. If they came down, he'd have the advantage of darkness and cover. But he didn't want to shoot anyone. He wasn't a killer. He was just a carpenter trying to honor a dead man's wishes. Light flooded down the stairway as someone lifted the trapdoor. "Holy hell!" a voice breathed. "It's here! The vault is real!" Footsteps on the stairs. Mason pressed himself against the wall, rifle ready, praying they wouldn't see him. A flashlight beam swept across the cellar, catching on the crates, the desk, the carefully preserved fortune. "Get Marcus on the radio," the voice commanded. "Tell him we found it. Tell him we found Cole's vault." 2 men descended, their flashlights illuminating the space. They were so focused on the crates they didn't notice Mason in the shadows. Not yet. "Look at this," one of them said, opening a crate. "Gold. Jesus, there must be millions here." "More than millions. This is it. This is what the old man spent 40 years looking for." Mason's finger rested lightly on the trigger. He could fire a warning shot, scare them off. But then what? They'd come back with more men, better armed, or they'd call the authorities themselves, claim they'd found the vault, spin some story about ownership rights. He was about to make a move when a third voice called down from above. "How much time do we need to extract everything?" "Days," one of the men in the cellar replied. "Maybe a week. There are dozens of crates. We'll need equipment, vehicles." "We don't have days. That mountain man knows we're here. If he reports this, we lose everything." "Then we find him first," the voice said coldly, "and make sure he doesn't report anything." Mason's blood turned to ice. They were talking about killing him. Casually, like it was just another problem to solve. He needed to get out of this cellar, needed to warn Tom, needed to get the authorities involved before these men made good on their threat. But he was pinned down, outnumbered and running out of options. Above ground, more vehicles arrived. Mason could hear engines, doors slamming, multiple voices. They were calling in reinforcements. One of the men in the cellar moved to the desk, examining Henry's letter. "Look at this. Instructions from Cole himself. He wanted this fortune used for charity." The man laughed. "Too bad, old man. You should have been more careful about who found it." Something in Mason snapped. He'd spent 2 years hiding from the world, avoiding conflict, letting life happen around him without participating. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. Henry Cole had spent years building this vault, had hidden his fortune with specific intent, had trusted that the right person would find it and honor his wishes. Mason might not be the right person, might not be worthy of that trust, but he'd be damned if he'd let these men desecrate Henry's legacy for profit. He stepped out of the shadows, rifle raised. "Get away from that desk," he said quietly. Both men spun around, their flashlights blinding him momentarily. "Who the hell—" "I said get away from the desk, and drop your flashlights." For a moment, nobody moved. Mason could feel his heart hammering, could taste copper fear in his mouth. He'd never pointed a gun at another human being. Never wanted to. "You're the mountain man," one of them said. "The one who's been watching us." "This vault belongs to someone else," Mason said. "Someone who wanted it used to help people. You're not taking it." The man smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You're outnumbered, friend. There are 10 of us up there and more on the way. You planning to shoot us all?" "If I have to." "I don't think so." The man took a step forward. "I think you're scared. I think you've never shot anyone in your life. I think you're going to lower that rifle and walk away before you get hurt." Mason's hands shook, but he kept the rifle steady. "Last warning." The man laughed and took another step. Mason fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the stone floor inches from the man's foot, ricocheting with a whine. Both men stumbled backward, shocked. "Next one doesn't miss," Mason said, his voice steadier now. "Get out, now." They scrambled for the stairs, flashlights forgotten. Mason followed them up, rifle trained on their backs. At the top, he found himself facing 8 more men, all turning toward the sound of the gunshot. For a long moment, everyone froze. Then Mason did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I believe you're trespassing on federal land. The Bitterroot National Forest, to be specific, and unless I'm mistaken, that's a felony when you're here to steal government property." One of the men, older, silver-haired, the one Mason assumed was Marcus, stepped forward. "That fortune isn't government property. It belonged to Henry Cole." "Did it?" Mason kept his rifle trained on the group. "Because I have Henry Cole's will right here. Left everything to charity. Specifically mentions his hidden assets. Makes it pretty clear that whoever finds them is supposed to use them to help people, not line their own pockets." Marcus's face darkened. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. My father spent 40 years searching for this vault. He deserved—" "Your father deserved nothing," Mason interrupted. "Henry's journals mention Vincent multiple times. Talk about how greedy he was, how he couldn't accept getting his fair share when the business sold. This fortune was never meant for your family. It was meant for people who actually need it." "You think you're some kind of hero?" Marcus snarled. "You're just a vagrant living in a shack. What are you going to do? Call the police? Tell them you found $290 million hidden in a mountain? They'll take it from you faster than we would." Mason's satellite phone was in his pocket. He pulled it out with his free hand, keeping the rifle steady with the other. "Let's find out," he said, and dialed 911. The next 6 hours were chaos. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, then state police, then federal agents from 3 different agencies. The logging road became a parking lot of official vehicles. Yellow tape went up around the stone hut. Mason was separated from the other men and questioned extensively. He told them everything: the storm, the fallen tree, the discovery of the vault. He showed them Henry's letter, the will, the meticulous records proving the fortune was obtained legally. He explained about Marcus and his men, about their plans to extract the fortune for themselves. Tom Garrett arrived around sunset, out of breath from the hike up the logging road. He pushed through the crowd of officials until he found Mason sitting on a fallen log, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, looking shell-shocked. "Jesus, Mason," Tom said, sitting beside him heavily. "When you said you needed a week, I didn't think you meant you were going to start a war." Mason laughed weakly. "Neither did I. Are you hurt?" "No. Tired. Scared. But not hurt." Tom looked toward the stone hut, where agents were carefully photographing and cataloging everything. "Is it really 290 million? Give or take." "And you actually pulled a gun on 8 men to protect it?" "I fired a warning shot. Didn't actually hit anyone." Tom shook his head in disbelief. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest." "Probably both." A federal agent approached, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mr. Cole, I'm Special Agent Reeves, FBI. We need to ask you some more questions." Mason stood, legs unsteady. "Whatever you need." The interrogation lasted hours. They wanted every detail, every moment from the discovery until now. Mason told them about the journals, about Vincent and his son Marcus, about the threats he'd overheard in the cellar. Marcus and his men had been arrested, charged with trespassing, attempted theft of federal property, and a handful of other crimes. Their expensive equipment had been seized as evidence. But the bigger question remained: what happened to the fortune? Agent Reeves laid it out plainly. The vault is on federal land, which gives the government first claim. However, Henry Cole's will and documentation suggest this was a deliberate bequest to charity. The legal situation is complex. It could take years to resolve. "And in the meantime?" Mason asked. "In the meantime, everything stays exactly where it is. The vault will be sealed, guarded, and protected until the courts make a determination." "What about Henry's wishes?" Agent Reeves's expression softened slightly. "I read his letter. It's clear what he wanted. But wanting something and having legal force are different things. The courts will take his wishes into consideration, but there's no guarantee they'll be honored." Mason felt something break inside him. He'd risked everything to protect Henry's legacy, and now it would be trapped in bureaucracy for years, maybe decades. The money that was supposed to help people would sit frozen in legal limbo while lawyers argued and judges deliberated. Tom must have seen it on his face. He put a hand on Mason's shoulder. "We'll fight it. We'll find a way to honor Henry's intentions." "How? Against the federal government?" "With the federal government, if we're smart. Henry left documentation proving charitable intent. That matters. And you're not some treasure hunter trying to get rich. You're a guy who fired a warning shot to protect a dead man's dream. That matters too." The sun had set hours ago. Mason was exhausted, overwhelmed, running on fumes and adrenaline. Agent Reeves finally released him with instructions not to leave the area and to remain available for further questioning. Tom drove him down to Clearwater in an old pickup truck. The town was asleep, dark except for streetlights and the neon sign at Ruth's General Store, which stayed lit all night. "You can stay at my place," Tom offered. "Your cabin's probably going to be crawling with investigators for a while." Mason nodded, too tired to argue. But when they pulled up to Tom's house, a small crowd was gathered on the front lawn. Ruth was there, along with the owner of the diner, the mechanic who sometimes fixed Mason's truck, a teacher from the local school, and at least a dozen other townspeople. They all turned when the truck stopped. For a moment, Mason thought they were angry, that somehow news of the fortune had spread and they blamed him for bringing chaos to their quiet town. Then Ruth stepped forward, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Mason Cole," she said loudly, "you just became a damn legend." The crowd erupted in applause. Mason sat frozen, stunned. Tom laughed beside him. Word travels fast in small towns. Everyone knows what you did up there, standing up to those men, protecting Henry Cole's wishes, calling the police instead of trying to keep it all for yourself. People are talking about nothing else. Ruth opened the truck door. "Come on, honey. We made food. Figured you could use a hot meal and some friendly faces." Mason climbed out slowly, overwhelmed. The crowd parted, letting him through, but hands patted his shoulders, voices murmured encouragement. Inside Tom's house, the dining room table was loaded with casseroles, pies, bread, soup. "We wanted you to know," Ruth said quietly, "that whatever happens with that fortune, you've got a whole town behind you. You did right by Henry Cole. That matters more than money." Mason's throat tightened. For 2 years he'd isolated himself, convinced he didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone. But standing in Tom's house, surrounded by people who'd taken time out of their evening to show support to a hermit they barely knew, he realized how wrong he'd been. Community wasn't just something you were born into. It was something you earned through actions, through character, through showing up when it mattered. He'd shown up. And so had they. Over the next week, the legal situation became clearer, though no less complicated. Henry Cole's will was legally sound. His documentation proved the fortune was obtained legitimately. His stated intent was unambiguous. The money was for charity, specifically for Montana's rural working families. The federal government's claim was strong but not absolute. The vault was on federal land, yes, but the Supreme Court had previously ruled that found treasures could belong to the finder if certain conditions were met, including proof that the original owner intended abandonment or specific transfer of ownership. Henry's letter, addressed to whoever finds this, created a legal grey area. Was it abandonment? Was it a conditional bequest? Lawyers couldn't agree. Meanwhile, Marcus and his men faced serious charges. Evidence found in their vehicles included maps, historical documents, and communications that proved they'd been searching for Henry's vault for over 15 years. Marcus's father, Vincent, had indeed been obsessed, had spent his last decades convinced Henry had cheated him out of a fortune. The irony was bitter. Vincent had received millions when Cole Timber sold. He'd died wealthy by any reasonable measure. But greed had poisoned him, had turned him into someone who couldn't see his own good fortune because he was too busy envying someone else's. Marcus had inherited that poisoned legacy, and now he'd face prison for it. As for Mason, his life transformed in ways he never expected. News outlets picked up the story. Mountain Man protects hidden fortune from thieves, honors dead man's charitable wishes. He became, despite his best efforts, famous. But it wasn't the fame that changed him. It was the process of fighting for Henry's legacy. Tom connected him with a non-profit foundation that specialized in rural development. Together, they crafted a proposal. If the courts awarded Mason any portion of the fortune as finder's fee, he would immediately donate it to a charitable trust dedicated to Henry and Margaret Cole's memory, focused on exactly the causes Henry had specified: healthcare, education, and economic opportunity for rural Montana families. The proposal was brilliant because it rendered the finder's fee question moot. Whether Mason got 10% or 50% didn't matter. All of it would go to charity regardless. It shifted the legal narrative from who gets rich to how best to honor Henry's wishes, and it gave the courts a clear, responsible path forward. Mason spent hours working on the proposal, researching rural health clinics, interviewing families about their needs, learning about educational programs and economic development initiatives. It was exhausting work, but it felt right. It felt like something Sarah would have been proud of. One evening, 2 months after the discovery, Mason sat with Tom in a small conference room at the Foundation's office. They'd just finished a presentation to a panel of federal mediators about their proposed solution. "You did good in there," Tom said, packing up papers. Real good, you spoke from the heart. Mason stared at his calloused hands. I keep thinking about Henry. How he spent years building that vault, hiding his fortune, hoping someone would find it and do the right thing. What if I'm not the right person? What if I mess this up? Tom leaned back in his chair. You know what I think? I think Henry knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't leave specific instructions because he understood that the right person wouldn't need them. The right person would care more about doing good than doing well. And Mason, you've proved that. You had chances to walk away rich. You didn't take them. That's exactly the kind of person Henry was hoping would find his fortune. I'm scared I'll disappoint him. Then you're definitely the right person. Only people who care about doing right are scared of doing wrong. 3 months after the discovery, a federal judge made a preliminary ruling. The fortune would be placed in a charitable trust, administered by a board that included Mason, Tom, representatives from the state of Montana, and members of rural community organizations. Henry's wishes would be honored. The money would help people. Mason would receive a finder's fee of 15%, approximately $43 million, which he immediately signed over to the trust, exactly as he'd promised. The ruling wasn't final, would face appeals, could take years to fully resolve. But it was a start, a real start. Mason stood outside the courthouse in Missoula, snow falling gently around him, Tom at his side. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but he barely heard them. He thought about Henry working alone in those mountains, stone by stone, building something that would outlast his grief. He thought about Sarah, who'd spent her life believing in the goodness of people even when they disappointed her. And he thought about himself, a broken man who'd run to the wilderness to hide and had somehow found a reason to come back. What now? Tom asked. Mason smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. Now we get to work. We've got $247 million to distribute responsibly. That's going to take time. You planning to stay involved? Every step of the way. Henry trusted whoever found his fortune to do right by it. I'm not walking away from that trust. They walked down the courthouse steps together, into the snow, into whatever came next. Behind them, the legal battle would continue. Ahead, the real work awaited, turning Henry's hidden fortune into hope for people who needed it. Mason had come to the mountains to escape. But in finding Henry's vault, he'd found something else entirely. Purpose, community, a second chance at living instead of just surviving. The mountain had given up its secret, and in doing so, it had given Mason back to himself. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. Marcus and his men pled guilty to federal trespassing and attempted theft charges in exchange for reduced sentences. They received between 3 and 7 years each, depending on their level of involvement. Marcus himself got the maximum, 7 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments to cover the cost of securing and protecting the vault. But the bigger victory came 6 months after the discovery, when federal judge Patricia Halloran delivered her final ruling on the disposition of Henry Cole's hidden fortune. Mason sat in the courtroom beside Tom Garrett, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The room was packed with reporters, federal officials, representatives from various charitable organizations, and people from Clearwater who'd driven the 3 hours to Missoula just to be there. Judge Halloran was a stern woman in her late 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd spent months reviewing every document, every piece of evidence, every legal precedent that might apply to this unprecedented case. This court has reviewed extensive documentation regarding the fortune discovered by Mason Cole in the Bitterroot National Forest, she began, her voice carrying authority. The evidence clearly establishes that Henry Cole, deceased in 1977, intentionally sequestered assets totaling approximately $290 million in current valuation, with the express intent that said assets be discovered and used for charitable purposes benefiting rural Montana families. Mason barely breathed. The question before this court is not whether Mr. Cole's intent was clear. It was. The question is whether that intent can be legally honored, given that the cash was located on federal land and whether Mr. Mason Cole, as finder, has any legitimate claim to the assets. Judge Halloran paused, looking directly at Mason. "Mr. Cole, please stand." Mason rose on shaky legs. Tom stood beside him, a steady presence. "This court finds that Henry Cole's documentation, including his last will and testament, his letter of intent, and his meticulous record-keeping, establishes a clear conditional bequest. He intended his fortune to be found and used for specific charitable purposes. While unconventional, this intent is legally sound." Mason's heart pounded. Furthermore, this court finds that Mason Cole, as finder, acted with extraordinary integrity throughout this process. Rather than attempting to claim or conceal the fortune, he immediately sought legal counsel, protected the assets from theft, and demonstrated consistent commitment to honoring Henry Cole's charitable intent. Such conduct is exceptionally rare in treasure trove cases and deserves recognition. The judge's expression softened slightly. "Therefore, this court rules as follows. The fortune discovered by Mason Cole shall be placed in a charitable trust, to be known as the Henry and Margaret Cole Foundation for Rural Montana. The foundation's sole purpose shall be to provide healthcare access, educational opportunities, and economic development support to working families in rural Montana communities, exactly as Henry Cole specified." Relief washed through Mason like a wave. As finder, and as the individual who protected this fortune at personal risk, Mason Cole is awarded a finder's fee of 20% of the total valuation, approximately $58 million. However, in recognition of Mr. Cole's stated intent to donate any finder's fee to the foundation he proposes, this court will structure the award accordingly. Judge Halloran looked down at her papers. "Mason Cole will serve as founding director of the Henry and Margaret Cole Foundation, with an annual salary commensurate with non-profit standards. His finder's fee will be paid directly to the foundation as its initial operating capital. The remaining 80% of the fortune will be transferred to the foundation over a 5-year period, allowing for responsible management and distribution." She brought down her gavel. "This court is adjourned." The room erupted. Reporters surged forward. People from Clearwater cheered. Tom grabbed Mason in a bear hug, tears streaming down the old lawyer's weathered face. "You did it," Tom said hoarsely. "You actually did it." Mason couldn't speak. He could only stand there, overwhelmed, as people crowded around to congratulate him. Ruth pushed through the throng and wrapped him in a hug that smelled like cinnamon and wool. "Henry would be so proud," she whispered. "So would Sarah." That broke something open in Mason. He hadn't cried since Sarah's funeral, hadn't allowed himself to. But standing in that courtroom, surrounded by people who'd supported him, who'd believed in him, the grief and relief and joy all crashed together. He wept, not quietly but openly, the kind of tears that had been building for years, and nobody looked away. They just let him cry, these people who understood that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is break down and let others help hold him together. The foundation launched 3 months later. Mason rented office space in Clearwater, a renovated storefront on Main Street that had once been a hardware store. He hired a small staff, an administrator who'd worked in non-profit management, an accountant, a grants coordinator, and a community outreach specialist. The first grant went to the Clearwater Medical Clinic, which had been on the verge of closing. $50,000 allowed them to hire a full-time doctor and purchase updated equipment. Within weeks, families who'd been driving 2 hours to the nearest hospital could receive care in their own town. The second grant funded a scholarship program for rural students pursuing vocational training. 25 young people received full tuition to community colleges and trade schools, learning skills that would allow them to build careers without leaving their communities. The third grant supported a small business development program, providing low-interest loans to entrepreneurs in mountain towns. A young woman opened a bakery. A veteran started a construction company. A retired teacher launched a tutoring service. One by one, quietly and deliberately, Mason and his team began fulfilling Henry's vision. But the transformation wasn't just about money. It was about belief. For decades, rural Montana communities had watched their young people leave, their businesses close, their towns slowly die. They'd been told they didn't matter, that the future belonged to cities, that small-town life was obsolete. The Henry and Margaret Cole Foundation said something different. It said these communities mattered, these families mattered, and with the right support, they could thrive. Mason traveled constantly those first months, visiting towns across western Montana. He met with families, listened to their needs, attended town hall meetings. He learned about communities struggling with opioid addiction, about ranchers facing foreclosure, about schools that couldn't afford textbooks. And slowly, methodically, the foundation began addressing these needs, not with handouts, but with investments, programs that built capacity, created opportunity, restored dignity. In Clearwater specifically, the changes were dramatic. The medical clinic expanded. The school received new computers and updated curriculum materials. 3 new businesses opened on Main Street. Young families who'd planned to leave decided to stay. The population, which had dropped to 347, grew to over 400 within a year. But perhaps the most significant change was intangible. Hope. People began believing their town had a future, that their struggles were seen and valued, that someone cared enough to invest not just money, but genuine attention. Mason worked 70-hour weeks, pouring everything he had into the foundation. But unlike his years in construction, unlike the 2 years he'd spent isolated in the mountains, this work filled him instead of draining him. He'd found purpose again, not the same purpose he'd had with Sarah, building a life together. This was different, bigger in some ways, more solitary in others, but it was real and meaningful and good. One evening in late fall, a year after discovering the vault, Mason stood in the foundation office after everyone had gone home. The walls were covered with photos. Families the foundation had helped, businesses they'd supported, students who'd received scholarships. Each photo represented a life changed, a hope realized. His phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Stop working and come to Ruth's. We're having dinner and you're invited." Mason smiled. Tom had become more than his lawyer. He'd become a friend, a mentor, a father figure to replace the one Mason had lost years ago. He locked up the office and walked the 3 blocks to Ruth's general store. The evening air was crisp, autumn giving way to winter. Clearwater looked different now, more alive. Lights glowed in shop windows, children played in yards. Someone had planted flowers in the planters along Main Street. Small changes, but they mattered. Ruth's apartment was above the store. When Mason climbed the stairs, he found not just Tom and Ruth waiting, but a dozen other people from town. The mechanic, the diner owner, the school principal, families the foundation had helped. "Surprise," Ruth said, grinning. "We're celebrating." "Celebrating what?" "You. 1 year since you discovered that vault and decided to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. That deserves recognition." They'd made dinner, a proper feast. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables from gardens that had thrived in Clearwater's renewed optimism. They ate together, laughing and talking, telling stories. Mason sat quietly, overwhelmed again by the generosity of these people. A year ago, he'd been a hermit, isolated and grieving. Now he was surrounded by community, by purpose, by something that felt dangerously close to joy. After dinner, the school principal stood up, a woman named Carol in her 50s who'd taught in Clearwater for 30 years. "I want to say something," she announced. "Mason, when you first came to town 3 years ago, you were running from pain. We all knew it. We gave you space because that's what you do in small towns. You let people grieve in their own way." Mason shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the center of attention. "But this past year we've watched you transform. Not just because of the money, though that's helped more than you know, but because of how you've handled it. With grace, with humility, with genuine care for people you don't even know. You could have walked away rich. Instead, you stayed and built something that matters." Carol's voice caught slightly. "My granddaughter received a foundation scholarship. She's studying to be a nurse. She'll be able to come back here, work at the clinic, help her own community. That's because of you. Because you honored a promise to a man you never met." Others began sharing stories. The mechanic's son had received a small business loan and opened an auto body shop. The diner owner had gotten a grant to expand her kitchen, allowing her to hire 3 more people. A young mother talked about the healthcare grant that allowed her daughter to receive treatment for asthma without driving 2 hours each way. One by one, they stood and told Mason how the foundation had changed their lives, not just financially, but fundamentally, giving them hope, opportunity, a reason to stay. Mason listened, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He'd spent 2 years in the mountains thinking his life didn't matter anymore, that Sarah's death had ended any purpose he might have had. But these people were telling him something different. They were telling him he mattered, that his choices had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. That one decision, to honor Henry Cole's wishes instead of claiming the fortune for himself, had changed dozens of lives, hundreds of lives. When everyone had finished sharing, Ruth stood and raised her glass. "To Mason Cole," she said, "who found a fortune in the wilderness and taught us that the greatest treasure isn't what you discover, but what you choose to do with it." They all raised their glasses. "To Mason." Mason stood, overwhelmed, searching for words. Finally, he simply said, "To Henry and Margaret Cole, who started all this, and to Sarah, who taught me that the only life worth living is one spent helping others. I'm just trying to live up to their examples." Later that night, Mason drove up to his cabin in the mountains. He'd kept it, couldn't quite bring himself to leave permanently. The foundation work kept him in town most of the time, but he still needed the silence of the wilderness, the space to think and remember. The cabin was dark and cold when he arrived. He built a fire, made coffee, and sat in the same chair where he'd spent so many nights drowning in grief. But tonight felt different. He pulled out a photo of Sarah, one he'd carried in his wallet for years. She was laughing in the picture, her hair blown by wind, her eyes full of life and mischief. God, he missed her. Still. Always. "I did something good, Sarah," he whispered to the photograph. "I think you'd be proud. I found something broken, and I fixed it. Not completely, not perfectly, but better than it was." He thought about Henry Cole, working alone in these same mountains, building a vault stone by stone. Henry had been running from grief too, trying to build something that would outlast his pain. And he had. The foundation bore his name and his wife's name. Their legacy was alive, growing, helping people decades after they'd both died. Mason realized something profound. Grief never really ended. You didn't get over losing someone you loved. The hole they left never filled in. But maybe, just maybe, you could build something meaningful around that hole. Use it as foundation instead of letting it consume you. Henry had done that, and now Mason was doing it too. The next morning, Mason returned to the stone hut for the first time in months. The vault had been emptied, its contents transferred to secure facilities while the foundation was established. The federal government had installed a gate securing the entrance, but Tom had arranged for Mason to have a key, recognizing his unique connection to the place. Mason descended the stairs slowly. The cellar was empty now, just bare stone walls and the old desk Henry had used. Someone had left Henry's letter on the desk, preserved in a protective sleeve. Mason read it again, Henry's words as powerful now as they'd been the first time. "Don't let it poison you. Don't let it make you into what I almost became, someone so focused on having that they forgot about being. Use it to help people. Use it to do what I couldn't figure out how to do. Make it mean something." Mason had done that, was doing that, would continue doing that for as long as the foundation existed. He sat at Henry's desk, running his fingers along the worn wood. 2 men, separated by decades, both shattered by loss, both seeking meaning in the wilderness. Henry had built a vault. Mason had discovered it. And together, across the years, they'd created something that mattered. "Thank you," Mason said quietly to the empty room, "for trusting that someone would find this and do right by it, for believing in people even when you had every reason not to, for leaving a legacy that continues to help people you never met." He climbed back up into the sunlight, locking the gate behind him. The stone hut would remain, a monument to one man's grief transformed into hope. Occasionally, the foundation brought donors or community members here, showed them where it all started, told them Henry's story. Because stories mattered, legacy mattered, and the choices people made, even in their darkest moments, rippled forward through time in ways they could never predict. 5 years after discovering the vault, Mason stood on a stage in Missoula at the Foundation's annual gala. The room was filled with donors, community leaders, families the Foundation had helped. They'd raised an additional $30 million through grants and private donations, multiplying Henry's original fortune. The Foundation now operated in 42 rural Montana towns. They'd built 3 new medical clinics, funded scholarships for over 200 students, supported 93 small businesses, and provided emergency assistance to countless families facing crisis. Mason was 43 now, his beard still more gray than brown, his face still weathered from years in the mountains. But his eyes were different. They held purpose, warmth, the look of someone who'd found his way home after being lost. He approached the podium to scattered applause. 5 years ago, he began, I was living alone in a cabin 7 miles from civilization. I'd lost my wife, lost my way, lost any sense that my life had meaning. I wasn't suicidal, but I wasn't really living either. I was just existing, waiting for time to pass. The room was silent, listening. Then a storm knocked down a tree and revealed a stone hut. Inside that hut was a fortune, yes. But more importantly, inside was a letter from a man named Henry Cole, written 46 years ago, asking whoever found his hidden wealth to use it to help people. Mason paused, emotion thick in his throat. I'd like to tell you I was heroic, that I immediately knew the right thing to do. But I wasn't, and I didn't. I was terrified, confused, overwhelmed. I almost walked away a dozen times. But I kept thinking about Henry's letter, about his trust that someone someday would do the right thing. He looked out at the audience, making eye contact with people whose lives had been changed by the Foundation. What I've learned over these 5 years is that treasure isn't found in vaults or measured in dollars. Real treasure is connection, community, purpose. It's the ability to help someone when they need it most. It's the privilege of being part of something bigger than yourself. His voice strengthened. Henry Cole hid a fortune in the mountains because he couldn't figure out how to give it away properly in his lifetime. But he trusted that someday someone would find it and know what to do. I'm not sure I've always known what to do. But I've tried. We've all tried. And together, we've built something that I think Henry and Margaret would be proud of. Mason held up a photo, blown up large enough for the room to see. Henry and Margaret Cole on their wedding day, young and hopeful and full of dreams. This foundation is their legacy, but it's also ours. Every volunteer, every donor, every family we've helped, every community we've supported, you're all part of this story. You're all treasure, worth infinitely more than gold or bonds or currency. He set down the photo. So thank you for believing in this mission, for understanding that rural communities matter, that working families deserve support, that no one should be invisible just because they live far from cities. Thank you for helping turn one man's hidden fortune into hope for thousands of people. The room rose in applause, but Mason barely heard it. He was looking at a woman in the back row, someone he'd met 6 months ago at a Foundation event. Her name was Eleanor. She taught at a small school the Foundation supported. They'd become friends, then something more. She smiled at him, proud and warm, and Mason felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not the consuming love he'd had with Sarah that could never be replicated, but something gentler, steadier. The possibility of companionship again, of building a new kind of life alongside someone who understood loss but chose hope anyway. After the gala, Mason drove back to Clearwater. The Foundation office would open tomorrow, Monday, and there were grant applications to review, families to help, communities to support. The work never ended, and he was grateful for that. He parked on Main Street and sat for a moment, looking at the town that had become his home. Lights glowed in windows. A couple walked hand in hand toward the diner. Somewhere, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds of ordinary life, precious beyond measure. Mason thought about the journey that had brought him here, the grief that had driven him to isolation, the storm that had revealed a hidden vault, the choice to honor a stranger's wishes instead of claiming wealth for himself, the slow, difficult process of rebuilding purpose from the ruins of loss. He'd found a fortune in the mountains. But what he'd really found was himself, the parts of him that Sarah had loved, the parts that wanted to build and help and connect. Those parts had survived, buried beneath grief, but not destroyed. Henry Cole's legacy wasn't just the money he'd hidden. It was the belief that people, given the chance, would choose compassion over greed. That trust, extended across decades, had been honored. And in honoring it, Mason had discovered that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about carrying loss forward and using it to create meaning. Sarah would always be part of him. Henry and Margaret would always be part of this foundation. Loss didn't disappear, but it could transform into something powerful, something that helped others carry their own burdens. Mason climbed out of his truck and walked toward his apartment above the foundation office. Tomorrow he'd wake early and review applications from families who needed help. He'd call donors and thank them for their support. He'd meet with his staff and plan next quarter's grants. It was good work. Hard work. The kind of work that left you tired but satisfied. The kind that meant something. And somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, a stone hut stood empty but not forgotten, a monument to the truth that the greatest fortunes aren't found in vaults. They're built through choices, through compassion, through the courage to believe that one person can make a difference. Anyone can find treasure if they're lucky. But it takes something deeper to transform that treasure into legacy, to honor the dead by serving the living, to turn personal grief into collective hope. Mason Cole had done that. Henry Cole had trusted he would. And together, separated by nearly half a century, two men who'd lost everything that mattered had created something that would help people for generations to come. Because sometimes the poorest mountain man discovers the richest truth, that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve purpose, that legacy is measured not in dollars but in lives changed, and that the greatest gift you can give the world is using whatever you've found, whatever you've been given, to make someone else's burden lighter. The end. Up next, two more incredible stories of courage, legacy, and lives transformed. Click now to continue the journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that the truest treasures are the ones we choose to share.